Congress.
Congress.
Congress. Congress.
Congress.
Congress.
Congress shall make no law.
Make no law respecting an establishment
of religion.
Or prohibiting the
free exercise thereof.
or abridging the freedom
the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right
of the people peaceably
assemble,
and to petition the government
a redress of grievances.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kevin A. Johnson, and I'm here with Dr. Craig R. Smith, who is the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies at California State University, Long Beach. We're here to discuss his book, Silencing the Opposition. In the previous episode, we talked about the framing of the Constitution. We talked about the alien and sedition crisis, along with the road to abolition ending in the Civil War. We also talked about some of the current lessons that we can learn. So in this episode, we'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the labor movement. After the Civil War, what were some of the things that gave rise to the labor movements in the United States?
Well, during the Civil War, while all that was going on, we were completing the Transcontinental Railroad. And that led to a lot of jobs and a lot of people being organized into specialties. And then the Industrial Revolution continued in the United States. And unfortunately, the captains of industry weren't very good to their employees. And so they began to organize. The Knights of Labor were formed. Samuel Gompers, who worked in a cigar factory, began to put people together, eventually became the American Federation of Labor. And so there was this movement, and in order to get the demands that they wanted, higher salaries, benefits, so on, lower children's working hours, all of that kind of thing, there were demonstrations. And that's, of course, a First Amendment right. You have the right to peaceably demonstrate. Well, they also got involved with strikes. And so the captains of industry decided that they needed to close down the labor movement to defeat it and not allow their companies to be unionized. And that was the inception of the crisis.
So what were some of the government strategies used to silence the labor movement?
Well, the first was that they would take the strike to court and get an injunction from a judge who would declare that the strike was illegal and that the workers had to go back to work, so that they would suspend it that way. The next thing they did, some of them, was to associate the labor movement with the anarchist movement and to say that these people really were trying to tear the country apart and they were interested in anarchy and that they were very dangerous. And so they painted the labor movement as a major threat to the legitimacy of the United States government.
So what was the role of the anarchist movement in the labor movement?
Well, certain labor unions had anarchist members. It was a natural place for the anarchists to go to defeat government, to defeat the captains of industry. And so labor unions were infiltrated by anarchists. Samuel Gompers, to his credit, tried to keep them out and kept the American Federation of Labor inside the Democratic Party. And that historically is how that began, because he felt that working inside the system made them look less like radicals. Now, at the same time, we had a third party movement called the Populist Party movement, and that too danced with the anarchists a little bit and got people concerned.
So what were some of the significant events that the anarchist movement were involved in?
Probably the most significant event was the Haymarket Riot. In Chicago, a bomb was thrown at the Haymarket and killed a lot of people, including some policemen. And that led then to a clamping down on the labor movement. It was a real tragedy, and it was a disaster for the labor movement, and it really retarded them. And that was in the 1890s. And the labor movement would not recover from that until probably after World War I.
Were there other acts that were significant at the time that the anarchist movement were involved in?
Well, probably the most significant act and the most tragic was the assassination of President McKinley. A man named Scholgels, who was a disciple of Red Emma Goldman, a leading socialist, communist, anarchist type of person, called Red Emma because of her hair, not because of the communist infiltration. Scholgels went to the Buffalo World Exposition in 1901, in September of 1901, pretended he had a broken arm, and when he got to the president, he had a gun in the sling and shot President McKinley, who, as he was falling, said, "Don't hurt him," meaning Scholgels. It was such a prominent event that they brought Thomas Alva Edison in to try and find some of the bullets. He couldn't find them all, and the president eventually died. 6 weeks later, Scholgels was executed in the electric chair, and Edison filmed it. And it was the first motion picture, and Edison named it that. They asked him, "What are we going to call it?" And he said, "Let's call it a motion picture." And that's where they came from.
So in terms of the government strategies, what kind of acts and legislation were going on at the time in order to suppress the labor movement?
Well, the labor movement didn't have a lot of political support because it wasn't large enough to be a political party. It got some support from the populist movement, some support inside the Democratic Party, and by this time the Republican Party is pretty much the captive of the business interests in the country. So there wasn't much that labor could do legislatively to protect its rights. That would come later. So basically the government relied on injunctions and subjugating labor to rules that they didn't apply to other people.
And so throughout this conflict, how did it end up getting resolved in terms of our freedom of expression?
Eventually the striking was allowed as long as it was nonviolent, and demonstrations were allowed as long as they were nonviolent. But it took well into the next century before labor got the rights. It's one of the longest lasting crises we've had in our history.
And who were the major opposition parties involved in representing labor and opposing labor at that time?
Well, obviously industry was opposed to labor and didn't want to be unionized. And so they fought with labor. And because industry had so much money and there were no campaign spending limits until 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt, bless his soul, restricted corporate contributions in federal campaigns, the corporations ran the politicians and the politicians were unfavorable to labor.
Okay, so what was the role of the Supreme Court during this time? Are there any significant findings in this era?
The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed by the Congress to try and break up monopolies. And Theodore Roosevelt also was a trust buster, trying to break up monopolies so that there would be more competition, and therefore that would help labor out. And so one of the things that the Supreme Court reviewed was whether the Sherman Antitrust Act was constitutional. And the problem with that was, of course, that the E.C. Knight case, which was about the sugar monopoly, the Supreme Court upheld the sugar monopoly's right to do things and to combine and to be a monopoly. It was a very bad Supreme Court decision, but it really hurt the antitrust movement.
And what was the response to the Supreme Court by the people?
The people believe, a lot of people in the United States believed that the labor movement was a populist or an anarchist movement, and so they weren't very sympathetic unless they were in the labor movement. And when it got violent with the Haymarket tragedy and the bombing there, and when Scholgos shot the President of the United States and killed him, people were very unsympathetic to the labor movement at that time.
And what do you think some of the lessons that we can learn today that are relevant based on this era of history?
Well, I think one of the things that we really need to focus on that comes out of the labor movement is the whole business of minority rights. I mean, they were a small group and they were just getting voice and they had been marginalized and they were totally outnumbered and outspent. And those are the very people that were intended to be protected under minority rights. And labor's a good example of that.
Okay, so when we move forward from the labor rights movement, the book talks about the next major crisis occurring during the suffragist movement. Yeah. What were some of the conditions that led to the suffragist movement and the conflict over First Amendment freedoms?
Well, the first thing it flows out of is the Civil War. After the Civil War, we passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which not only gave citizenship to former slaves, but allowed black men to vote. Well, if you're going to allow black men to vote, or men in general, why don't you allow women to vote? And so the suffrage movement, which started in England, spread to the United States, led by people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were seeking a woman's right to vote, which made sense. But the thinking in the political parties was a woman's place was in the home, politics is rough and dirty, and women shouldn't be involved with it. And so it took a long time before women got the right to vote. And part of it was during World War I and the demonstrations that took place during World War I.
So what were some of the governmental strategies responding to this movement to get a woman's right to vote?
One of the worst was when the women marched in Washington, they got no police protection. And people on the sides of the demonstration would throw garbage at the women, would spit at them. Several women were roughed up, and the police didn't do anything about it. So that was strategy number one. Strategy number two was to give them bad parade routes where they wouldn't be seen by a lot of people. They claimed that the White House, where Woodrow Wilson was the president during the war, World War I, was endangered, and therefore we will make you march way over here where nobody will see you and you won't have much effect. So that was one of the major strategies, was to marginalize people.
So what did the women's movement do as a response to those particular strategies?
The women insisted that they had a right to picket the White House. And when people came to try and stop the picketers, they actually chained themselves to the fence around the White House. So they were then, that was their tactic to get noticed. And they got a lot of newspaper coverage for that. And so President Wilson ordered that they be taken away from the fences and put in jail. Mm-hmm. And while they were in jail, they went on hunger strikes. So that was another tactic to try and get attention, and it did. But then the president ordered that they be force-fed. And so they were really treated as if they were terrorists or something, and badly abused while they were in prison. It's a horrific story that people don't know enough about.
So who were the major political parties that actually gave voice to the women's movement in terms of being able to support them in the legislative process?
Well, from day one, Theodore Roosevelt was a big supporter of the women's right to vote. And of course, he'd been a very popular president. He had not been able to get an amendment to the Constitution through in his 2 terms as president following McKinley. But that meant that the Republican Party was then in favor of a women's right to vote. And it's not by coincidence that the first woman who goes into Congress, into the House, is a Republican, and the first woman senator is a Republican, and the first woman on the Supreme Court is a Republican. The Republicans were big on getting women to vote, and the Democrats opposed it. And part of it was that now the labor union was beginning to have an influence within the Democratic Party, and that was mainly men, and they didn't want women voting because they didn't think they would support the labor movement. So women finally got the right to vote in 1920 when the amendment was passed, and that was the first election that they voted in. And of course, the Republican won overwhelmingly, Warren Harding.
Well, and how did they get the popular support behind them? Were there significant events that were able to persuade the public to get the right to vote?
I think once they were tortured in jail and got attention for that, people began to think this is really going too far. This has gotten out of hand, and the women got a lot of sympathy at that point. States then began to enfranchise women and allow them to vote, and it went state by state, and then finally it bubbled up to the
Were there
federal
any
government.
significant states that actually denied the right of women to vote?
There were states. Some Midwestern states, some Southern states did not allow women to vote. They couldn't pass the legislation there. But progressive states like California, Wisconsin, Louisiana tended to give women the vote, and then it became a national issue.
And so what do you think are some of the lessons that we can learn today from this particular movement?
Well, I think once again, you know, you look back and you say, what were you thinking? Why didn't they have the vote? I mean, women play a very important part in all walks of life, and even did at that time. But, you know, it takes an attitude change to get some of this stuff done. And therefore, that's why I think it's so important that we allow people to demonstrate. We allow people to peaceably assemble to make their point so that they can get noticed. And then the law changes and the attitude changes.
So another major crisis that we had occurred during the Red Scares in America. And so I was wondering if you could give a little bit of voice as to what gave rise to the conditions of this Red Scare. What were people so afraid of in 1917?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Remember in one of our past episodes, we talked about the French Revolution. The rough equivalent to that was the Russian Revolution in 1917. It was really tragic because it took Russia out of the war, took Russia out of World War I, which gave the German side a boost. And then the Mensheviks, who were the democratic kind of force within the Soviet Union, was defeated by the Bolsheviks and Lenin, which was the communist influence. And they were talking about an international workers' league. They were talking about international communism. And so the fear of anarchism, which hadn't quite died away, was now revived in the communist movement. And then later, during the war, the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, under Woodrow Wilson, had his house bombed by communists. And I mean, imagine if that happened in the United States today. Ironically, one of the people living across the street from A. Mitchell Palmer at the time was Franklin Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So it could have been a huge tragedy and could have changed our history even more than it did. Luckily, A. Mitchell Palmer was not at home, nor was his family. But it really started a wave of anti-communism in this country. And Palmer ordered the arrest of all communists in the United States. 5,000, 10,000 people were incarcerated at this time during this first Red Scare that we had.